This is Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany. Inspiring and providing real insight to our listeners with every story. Exploring deep stories behind every guest. Please welcome your host, Bo Tiffany.
Hey, Robert. Thanks for coming back to Digital Voices. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, and thanks for having me back. And I love your show. I listen to it. I love your guest, and I'm honored and delighted to be back here.
It's my pleasure. You know, our last episode that we did together on hinge points of history and the Spanish Armada was able to shed insight to some really important historical figures and how those dynamics and strings played out, and how if something, happened that would have been just slightly different in so many different ways, that history would be different than what we know it as of today. And today we're going to be talking about California, which is your home state, and where you live and have for quite some time. You've been able to see it through a set of eyes that have grown as the culture and as the state has evolved into what it is today. And I think a lot of us that aren't from California don't necessarily know the insight of California, what it necessarily brings to the table, its importance, nor its history. And so I think today's talk about California is important and enlightening for the rest of us, because California is not only huge and known for its sunshine, but it's known for so many other things. So why don't you start us out?
Well, I'm a North Carolina boy at Tar Heel, and I was raised in the South by Southern parents. And my dad transferred out to Illinois with a job when I was a senior in high school. And I ended up graduating there. And I found my way to the University of California at Berkeley as a student, and never been to California. And I was so taken with the place that, I looking out over the bay from up on the hills in Berkeley over to the Golden Gate Bridge. And I thought right then, I'm going to seek my fortune in this place. And I have. And you're right. Coming from some place different like that enables you to look at a place and see it with different eyes, see it from, I saw it as a Midwesterner and a Centralerner, Southerner. And here was this place, and with this unique culture and this unique history, like nothing in the world. And so I did. I've stayed there ever since. I've been, I moved there in the late 60s, been ever since. And what I've discovered in traveling and everything is there's this fascination with California all over the world. And, I'd be, in Africa or Asia someplace and pull a map out and, map of the world and point to people and say, here's you. And they would nod, they'd get it. And then I would point to California and say, this is me. And these big smiles would come up, and they were very fascinated with California. And even in Europe today, there's tremendous fascination with California. And I give history tours in San Francisco, the city of San Francisco, and I have people come from Switzerland and Japan and all. And so I enjoy that part. And there's a fascination in the United States with California, always has been. And what I find strange, being from California, is just how much misinformation and how people think they know California, and they just don't have a clue about the real California. And for example, as I pointed out, and is that California has 3 times as many poor people as per capita as Iowa. It has 12 million under the federal definition of poverty, which is very low. And so, people think of it as a rich place. Well, it does have the Bay Area, for example, these 9 little counties around the Bay. That's the richest place in the world, the most educated place in the world. And then you have this LA basin, which is this vastly diverse, enormously wealthy area. Most Americans associate California with LA. And I went to New York when I had a securities firm many years ago. And the people in New York who fancy themselves very sophisticated, and they are, they would take me on about California, and their idea of California and understanding of it was just LA. And they, it was really quite some experiences there with them being frustrated with LA and stuff, and thinking, I said, look, I live in this city called San Francisco. It's north of there. There's this bridge and everything. They would laugh. California has always been a proxy for all kinds of things, and it's been a harbinger. It's been, Jack Kennedy said you can see the future in California. It happens there first. And so that's been a fascination of Americans. And because where California goes, America's going to go. And today it's become entangled as a proxy in the political wars and the culture wars. And, we could talk more about that. But this is just, to give you a background about what's interesting about it. It's this huge dynamic state of 40 million people that is the fourth largest economy in the world outside the United States, twice as big as Russia.
Well, and it wasn't always part of the United States, right?
Well, California was not part of, the original 13 colonies was not California. And California was...
Didn't the Spanish own it for a period of time?
That's a very interesting history there. The Spanish claimed these vast regions of the American West and of the South of South America and Mexico and all. And in the 18th century, the Russians had been coming east for centuries. They'd come in the 17th century. The Tsars had moved throughout the Russian landmass to the east. We went west. The Russians went east, and in the 18th century, they hired this Danish sea captain called Vitus Bering to explore the regions further east, and they discovered Alaska. And they colonized Alaska. They had a colony. Their capital was first on Kodiak Island. Then they built one in Yakutak, which is a little town on the southern end of Alaska, just northwest of Glacier Bay. Then they moved it to a third time to Sitka, which is this town in the southwestern part of Alaska. And they were moving south. And the king of Spain, I think it was Carlos V, he freaked out and he said, they're going to take our California away, but we've got to come up with something. So they found this priest, and his name was Junipero Serra. He was a Mallorcan from Mallorca, a guy with a PhD who one day said, he went to Madrid and said, send me to the New World. I want to be a missionary. This is a PhD in philosophy. Mm-hmm. And so they sent him to Mexico City as an inquisitor. He burned witches to the stake, and he was very enthusiastic. And they said, you're the guy for this project, this setting up 21 missions, boots on the ground in California to keep the Russians out. So he went to California and set up 19 or 21 missions, which were as a church, a little pueblo, a tiny little military base, and some mostly slave labor from the Native Americans to run it like a big plantation.
And that was in the San Francisco area, right?
Well, there was one in San Francisco. It was called Mission Dolores, which is sadness in Spain, because it was founded on a Sunday of the Day of Sorrows, and so they called it Mission Dolores. But there were 21 of them, and they were tiny. And Spain had a tenuous hold on California. I mean, in San Francisco, they never had more than 1,200 people. Mm. And it dwindled down, and Spain was largely financed. And people don't know this, but, Spain took all this gold. We all know about how they took the gold and the silver from the New World, and they just went and took it. But there were two mines, one in the highest parts of Bolivia called Potosi, and it was the most prolific mine in the history of the world. It was so prolific that with Zacatecas in Mexico, it propelled Spain into the forefront of European politics for over 200 years, this mine. And in the early 19th century, this mine started sputtering. It stopped producing the prodigious amounts of silver and some gold that it had produced. And when this happened, Spain, which had very little business space except for the Jews, they just didn't need taxes, they didn't have any businesses. They ran on this income that came in from their colonies, and they had this huge ecclesiastical bureaucracy and a huge military bureaucracy. And suddenly, in the 19th century, it ran out, and Spain just economically collapsed. And Napoleon Bonaparte saw that, and he sent his troops in. And in 1808, he conquered Mexico, he conquered Spain. I'm sorry, and put his brother on the Spanish throne in Madrid. And you can imagine how that went over in the Spanish parts of the world, like in California. It'd be like Putin going into Washington, putting his brother in the White House. And people say, I'm not paying taxes to that guy. So there was a revolt that broke out all over the Western Hemisphere. And Mexico was was one of them. And it started out in 1808 when this happened, and it gradually built speed. And by 1821, it succeeded. And California became the northernmost state of a new nation called Mexico, with a capital in Monterrey. And so California became Mexico, and then through this very fascinating history, which I can give you now if you'd like, about.
Sure. Well, you're going to get into the modern time. Might as well just talk a little bit about the history.
We're going to go to the modern times. I think people are more interested in the modern times. Let me just say that, Texas revolted from Mexico, succeeded, became a state, and then thought that the Mexicans were going to take them over. They went to Washington and said, can we become a state in the United States? And the U.S. said yes. And so Santa Anna, who was the military dictator, said, if you guys do that, we'll declare war on you, the United States. And they did, and Mexico declared war. And the president of the United States, James Knox Polk, was thrilled. He was a manifest destiny guy, and he used that as an excuse to send American warships, which sailed into the San Francisco Bay on July the 9th, 1848 and 1846, and they sent shells over the city. The Mexico ultimately surrendered, and Polk was smart enough to go to them and say, let's declare this an acquisition so we can make the war short and pay you $20 million. And they did. And Mexico ceded the entire southwestern United States to the United States, including California. And that became, they signed a treaty for that in February of 1848, and it became effective July the 4th, 1848, which at that point, California became a United States territory. And on September the 10th following year, 1850, it became, I think, the 33rd state in the United States.
So 1850, it became part of the U.S.
Now, 1848, it became U.S. territory.
Okay.
And it was not at that point a state. It did not become a state until it was
2 years later.
2 years later, in 1850, when it actually became a voting state.
When did the gold rush start?
The gold was discovered in a mill up in the Sierras in January of 1848. But nobody knew about it for quite some time. It wasn't until about May of that year that an entrepreneur leader in San Francisco, what was called the village of Yerba Buena, and he ran up and down the street because people were coming down with all this gold from the creek up there. And he said, there's gold. It's all over the American River. And everybody cleared out of the city and they raced up there. And he did this on May the 12th, 1848, which is considered sort of the very beginning of the gold rush. But still, most people didn't know. And so all these people went up there and they came back laden with gold. Mm. And it just grew and grew and grew. And, there had been all these reports over the centuries of gold discovered here and gold discovered here, and they usually came to nothing. But the U.S. Geological Survey published a report in 2012 that had been people trying to estimate how much gold really came out of those hills. And they reported that at least $12 billion in 2012 dollars was picked up in the streams of the Sierras in the first 5 years of the gold rush. That's an enormous amount of money in those days. And it fueled the biggest peacetime migration of people in history, if you accept the movement of Chinese to their cities. And they poured in from countries all over the world. But the really, it got into the press, and James Knox Polk was asked in his final State of the Union address about it, and people believed him, and they were very skeptical. And he said, these reports of gold in California are such a scale, they can scarcely be believed, but they have been verified by officers in the public service. That was his quote, which is the 19th century for it's all true. And it caused an explosion all over the world of people saying it's true. And they all raced into ships and everything to come to California to look for gold. And so that was in December of 1848 that he said that in the joint session of Congress, back when they gave the State of the Union address in December. He said, now we give in January. And So the following year was 1849, and that was the year in which these hordes of people, 300,000 to 500,000 people, came to California, which is on the other side of the world from everywhere. And it was beyond the middle of nowhere. And so that's the year of the so-called 49er that caused the population to go from nothing. San Francisco was about 200 some people, to just explode.
Let me ask you really quick. So the natives that were native to the Americas, were they kind of pushed out previous to 1848, or were they pushed out as a result of the implosion from the gold rush, that race?
That's a really good question. California was first populated about 13,000 years ago by natives that came over from Siberia via the land bridge over Alaska. And they came down the coast to California in canoes and began to populate.
That would have been the Clovis Indians, correct?
No, I don't think those were the Clovis Indians. So
okay, I thought
the Clovis ones came from the south. There was another, they came from New Mexico, and they came from all directions. They came from the east, from the south, and they came from the north, which was coming in from the western side, from Siberia. But there were over 100 languages spoken. California had more Native Americans than any other state. It had 500,000 Native Americans speaking 100 languages in this vastly diverse environment. And a lot of these tribes were much more advanced. And the archaeologists went on to the Channel Islands just off Santa Barbara, and they when the Native Americans came here 13,000 years ago, it was an ice age, and there was no San Francisco Bay. The water was 400 feet below where it is. It was just a big verdant valley with more wildlife than either place, some archaeologists been any place ever in history. The saber-toothed tigers and camels and horses and all manner of these prehistoric animals, bison and mastodons, what they were, and they were all there. And so, but the warming brought the water back up, inundated a lot of these Native American places because you couldn't see the ocean from San Francisco. It was 35 miles out. But they went on to these caves in the Channel Islands off of Santa Barbara and found in there arrows and bones and charcoal, and dated it all to 13,000 years ago. So they know they came through there on their way south. So California was populated in every which direction by 100 tribes of Native Americans speaking different languages, and very isolated from each other because of they developed different technologies and living in these different places. And there weren't any big wars, and they didn't make any big constructions that we know about like they did in Mexico. And they kind of moved around a bit. But when the first Spanish contact happened in the 18th century, they spread the white man's disease. And Europeans had been living in these cities and communicating with each other for thousands of years, and they developed immunities that.
So we're talking like smallpox and things like that.
Cholera, a whole series of them. And they were so vociferous, so deadly to the Native Americans that before gold was discovered, half of the native population in California was already dead from these diseases, not from wars and things like that, just from the diseases that they had encountered from the white man. And then came the gold rush, which is when the pushing out that you talked about happened. I mean, and there was some tragic stuff in my county here in Maryland, just north of the Golden Gate Bridge. There was a very advanced civilization called the Miwoks. And, they were sitting on this valuable land, and they had these little villages there. And so they passed a law saying they couldn't go into court, and they began to take their land away from them and all these, and then at that point, there were like 6 epidemics that all overlapped each other. Right, and the Miwoks were just wiped out. 90% of them died. This conflict was avoided, but not because it was resolved. It was avoided because they all died. And there were these villages that looked like ghost towns because they were, and there was nobody there. And so the white man came in, took what he wanted because they were gone. And that's what happened. But there were there were other armed conflicts as late as the 1890s in Northern California, way up in Modoc County, which is the northeastern corner. There was powerful Indian groups there that actually went to war with the American military and had fought gun battles with them because of the same thing. They wanted to push them out of the way. And and I think in many instances, the disease factor became the defining thing. But in the early colonization of California, there wasn't a lot of interaction with the Native Americans was done by the Spanish, and they were notoriously cruel to the Native Americans and kept them as serfs, basically, on the missions, did not pay them. And it was pretty horrible what they did. And that's why recently, there was some riots here around the George Floyd thing, and they tore down Junipero's statue in Golden Gate Park because he was the head priest who had led these people in, and the Spanish in, and became the colonizer. And so when I give presentations about that, I tell the other side of it as well, which is that Junipero Serra was on the spectrum of things in that brutal age. He was extremely pro-Native American. He would jump in front of the bayonets of the drunken soldiers and say, "You can't touch these people," when they burned down Mission San Diego. And there was a lot of things where he personally, at great personal courage, would try to protect them. So he was complicated, like other people in history, was complicated. But he was also in charge of this system where the Spanish believed that if you could baptize a Native American, that made them eligible to get into the kingdom of heaven. They could not get in the door if they weren't baptized. And so if you could baptize them, they would spend the rest of eternity thanking you in heaven for getting them there. And they really believed that. And they believed that God would look favorably on them if they baptized lots of these people. And so that was the rationale that led to a lot of this stuff. But the priest, there was a book published, which is on part of the library I maintain for the Gold Rush Tour, which I lead, that is an anthology of the actual reports of people from countries all over the world who came to San Francisco back in the Spanish times and up to the Gold Rush. And there's their actual reports back home and some of what they discovered and saw when they got here. And we're talking, some of them were Spanish, some were Russians, some were Americans, British, French, Chileans. And the one uniform thing about those reports is they report extreme, shocking levels of brutality and indifference by the priest toward these Native Americans.
Right.
So that's the response about that.
Let me bring us a little forward. So I wanted to know that part of the history, but the other part that I want to know about is, to give you an example, the East Coast was made a lot of its money with slavery. As an addition to that, there was plantation owners and big money that settled that area post the Emancipation of Proclamation that freed the slaves. So with that parallel, was California settled with big money post Gold Rush that helped to influence that very beginning roots?
No, it really wasn't. And the United States, there was a very sharp divide at the Mason-Dixon line. The south of that line, in the South, it was an agricultural economy. It was basically cotton based, and cotton is very intense labor intensive. That was not viable without slave labor, and so that's drove this hugely. In the North, it was an industrial trade based agricultural economy that was fairly healthy, and the North had the very intense educational culture. They had schools and things, and the South didn't. And I can tell you this as a Southerner whose ancestors have graveyards full of people who died in the Civil War. I've got more Civil War ancestors who died in the Civil War than, and the South was a culture that was based on this, where there were these idle owners, and they gambled and drank, and there were not that many universities. And so when the Civil War came along, the South really never had a chance. I mean, that's one thing that's not culturally appreciated. They had a quarter of the population in the military output, and no guns, and so they had lots of military universities that were extremely effective, and they had leaders that were just brilliant, and they had almost all the military leaders that existed at that point, and which is why they dragged it out. And then Lincoln picked this guy, William Henry Halleck, as the head of the Union Army, who was a brilliant guy, but he was incompetent as a general. He couldn't make any decisions, and so he kept letting these wily Southern generals get away. And that dragged out the Civil War for years and ran up this huge death toll that made it one of our most deadly. It was our most deadly war by far. And so the cotton wears out land. So that drove a westward migration of these planters of cotton, and they moved to Texas. And Texas was not Texas was Tejas. It was a northern state of Mexico. And Mexico was a militantly abolitionist society. And they went there and they set up these cotton plantations, and they brought slaves. And the Mexican says, you can't have slaves. And they said, we're going to have them anyway. And the Mexican said, will you pay taxes? And they said, no. And only when these, they started having, the Mexicans sent some people trying to enforce the law, and they killed them. And that brought Santa Anna, and that brought this war with Mexico. And the history of it has been tremendously romanticized by this one movie that was funded by John Wayne, written by John Wayne, and acted on by John Wayne. It was very popular. It was critically panned. Who gave this very, very romanticized version of what happened in Texas with these three guys, Bowie and Davy Crockett and this other guy, and they were wanted by the authorities in the other states, and so a very different history. And the history professors in Texas have, and the Texas passed laws that say you can't report what really happened. You have to stick with this mythology. But so there was
That's amazing.
So by the time California came, there was this meager, tiny Spanish thing with these missions just barely hanging on. I mean, just a few thousand people. And then it's not really widely known. 1835, California, when Texas revolted, California declared its independence and got a flag and started flying and said, we're an independent country. And they weren't recognized by any country, which in international law means you're not a country, just an insurgency.
Right.
So what happened is they watched what happened. And at that point, 1835, and that's late in the game here, there was only 5,000 non-Native Americans in the whole state. So, and there was no businesses. They were just this, and they were given land grants. They give them ranchos. The Spanish government gave people ranchos, which was this land grant. There's some immense amount of land, and they raised cattle on it. And so that was California, and the economy was tiny. And so what happened is the leader, Alvarado, of 1835, looked around. He saw these ships going up and down the coast, looking at California, saying, maybe we could just take this over. And he realized he didn't have a chance. That Texas couldn't hardly make it. They ended up thinking they couldn't make it with 35,000 people. Mm-hmm. California had 5,000 non-Native Americans. So he went back to Mexico and said, brothers, can we renegotiate this? And Santa Anna was so humiliated by what had happened in Texas that he let them come back and made this deal with them that California would be an autonomous state of Mexico protected by the Mexican army. And
obviously,
so that's where they left it, in 1835.
What we're talking about in Texas would have been the Alamo, right? With Santa Anna.
It was the Alamo. The Alamo was this indefensible church. It was a mission thing, and it wasn't a military thing. And they never had a prayer. And so the locals told everybody, so you guys don't stay in there, get out of there. And the three leaders who were heroized in this movie and everything is staying and fighting to the last minute. They actually tried to escape ignominiously, leaving their colleagues behind. They were caught by Santa Anna and executed, ignominiously executed. And so this history, there's a book out now. It's a fascinating book. It's called Forget the Alamo. It's a takeoff on Remember the Alamo. And it's by three history professors at the University of Texas in Austin. And they have, and this has been around. I mean, it's copiously documented, and it always has been. And what set up the mythology was John Wayne's 1960 movie in the which was kind of in the height of the Cold War, and people liked that idea of this patriotism and this great mythical. So now this is subject of a big debate in the United States over how do you teach the past, and critical race theory and all this stuff. It's a very fascinating thing, and it's been debated this week in the New York Times. Edsel has got a great. He's a conservative, and he's got this. He makes the case with, not teaching, this what he thinks of as progressive, where you make the United States out to be this criminal enterprise that was full of corruption and everything. And he says you can't have patriotism with that, but we can, and he does take the position that there are ways of explaining what happened in our history, which was quite remarkable and quite heroic in my view, as it was. I mean, the idea that okay, so it's white men over 21 and own property who get to vote, but just the very idea that you were going to have a democracy and have everybody vote and pick the leaders, that's so revolutionary when it happened, and so visionary, that it's something we could all be proud of and excited without having to, mythologize, the slave thing. And there's always been that tension, with the guy who wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of." This guy had 174 slaves. Yeah. So, I think that we can reconcile those things and be proud to be Americans and proud of that tradition, which inevitably, once it was in place, would inevitably liberalize and broaden to include, non-property owners, and then women, and then eventually blacks, and eventually 18-year-olds. And, that was still history that we can be proud of without mythologizing it. But in answer to the question, which was a long, is that, California is much smaller and tinier economy with much less people than is even understood. As late as 5,000 people. And what happened is that gold was discovered in vast quantities in the Sierra foothills. And that led to this immense, instantaneous city. I mean, San Francisco was called the Instant City because there was nothing there but a tiny village. And within, 2 years, there's 50-some thousand people. And then it doubled to 150,000 within a couple of years. And then it went to 300,000 people by 1870, and then to 200,000 by 1890. It was 150,000 by 1870, 300,000 by 1890. And it went on up and was the only city west of Chicago. And it was an incredibly sophisticated place with all this stuff, the only city west of Chicago. But it happened instantaneously. And it was only in San Francisco that the rest of the state, it took 2 generations before there were as many people in the rest of California as there was voters, as there was in the city limits of this little tiny city of San Francisco. It's only 6 by 8 miles. Yeah. To this day, it's only 6 by 8 miles. You can walk across it.
Well, what I find interesting too is that when the gold dried up, San Francisco still had enough other industry to survive.
Well, what happened on that is that the gold did in fact dry up, and it dried up very fast. And when it did, it was the late 1850s. San Francisco plunged into a deep recession for which it would never have recovered, really, and it would have shriveled. But what happened is that when it plunged into this deep recession, suddenly they discovered the Comstock lode, which was this immense deposit of silver in Virginia City, Nevada. And California, San Francisco money, San Francisco investors, San Francisco miners, San Francisco capital, people, supplies, everything.
That infrastructure moved out that way?
Went out there and set it up and profited from it, funded it, supplied it, banked it, and
money
the Comstock load of the silver in the hills around Virginia City of Nevada was 3 to 5 times bigger than the gold rush. I mean,
wow.
the silver rush is really what put San Francisco on the map. The gold rush put it on the map, but the silver rush made it vastly rich. And just as the silver rush was really getting going in 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad arrives in San Francisco. And so, those 3 dates were really what set up California as this enormously wealthy and permanent place. Was first the gold in 1849, and then the silver 1859, and then the Transcontinental Railroad shrunk in 1869. And what was a place that took 6 to 9 months to get to, a generation before that, 20 years before that, you could get on a train and take the express trains, and in 2 weeks or 12 days, you could get to Washington. Then they actually reduced that down to about 3 days, and you could go from San Francisco to New York in 3 days. I mean, that just blew people's minds, and it transformed California.
I think this is a good segue for us for your pre-recorded. I think that also, if you're interested, the thing that's fun about what we've been talking about for the last half hour is that these intricate threads of history, if we didn't have the gold rush, if we didn't have the Comstock load, if we didn't have the Intercontinental Railroad, then California wouldn't be what it is today, and it would have a different history and it would have a different look. And just like the Spanish Armada, there were certain strings and a lot of different players that were all involved. And with California, you also have Santa Ana and Mexico and Texas and all of this region in turmoil with a lot of different threads going on, which I find really interesting. And so if you're interested, I think you would be really great at laying out those threads in a way that tells the earlier history, which I would love to hear too. But what we have for our listeners now is California kind of from 1900 on? Is that what we're looking at?
I came up even later than that. Pretty much it's my podcast, the rest of the podcast is a contemporary California, because that's the one that we recognize, and it's transformed so much in the last 10 or 20 years or 30 years and it's become this iconic visionary place for the whole world, imaginative place for the world in a number of different ways that are not all appreciated. And besides being, of course, the tech capital of the world. And today, in 2020, 25% of all the venture capital on Earth was invested in a tiny area of San Francisco, within the city of San Francisco. And they're building the future there. And, 30 years from now, people are going to look back and say, how did people ever get by back in 2021 without A, B, C, and D, which are the things that are being invented today as we speak in San Francisco?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to give too much away. I think the insight and the perspective that you're going to get, listeners, is going to make you look at California in a different way, with a broader view and a better appreciation, in my opinion. I know that's what I walked away with. So with that said, this is Robert Mills with California.
He was right. Since it joined the United States as a state at the start of the gold rush in May of 1850, California has been a trendsetter and a source of fascination the world over. Today, California is one of the most influential, consequential, misunderstood, fascinating, and in many quarters, resented places on Earth. Stick with us for this hour on Digital Voices, and you're going to be amazed at what you will learn about California. Because most of what people think they know about California, including many of us Californians ourselves, is often exaggerated or misleading. And many things that are widely believed about California are simply not true. So let's jump in. First off, to understand California, it helps not to think of California as a single place, nor even a region of places. California is more like a realm of regions, each one more diverse, distinctive, and different than the other parts of California, than any other place on Earth. How? They're different in terms of rainfall and temperature and climate and vegetation, in terms of economy, demographics, income, education, population, elevation above sea level, and a whole lot of other things as well. California is internally more diverse within its own borders than any other place on Earth. Well, just this week it was 50 degrees in San Francisco, and a mere 50 miles inland it was 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is the highest temperature spread at the same elevation of any place on Earth. So let's look at some other fun examples of how California is a land of superlatives and extremes. California is the highest mountain summit in the continental United States, Mount Whitney, at 14,505 feet. There are permanent ice fields up there and along the summits of the other nearby Sierra Nevada mountain summits. And there are glaciers only 35 miles north of Mount Whitney. And Mount Whitney's summit is a mere 80 miles as the crow flies from Badwater, which is the name of the seasonal lake on the floor of Death Valley that is 282 feet below sea level, the lowest spot not only in the United States, but in all of North America. So the highest and lowest places in the continental U.S. are in California, and they're only 80 miles apart. And Badwater also has the distinction of being the hottest place, not only in the U.S., but the hottest place on the whole planet Earth during the summer months. One day last summer in July of 2020, the temperature reached 130 degrees Fahrenheit in Furnace Creek in Death Valley, which is nearby, and that's where the official temperature is kept. There is no official climate station at Badwater itself, which is lower and believed to be hotter still than Furnace Creek. Furnace Creek is the headquarters of the Death Valley National Park, a national park that is 5,270 square miles, almost the size of the state of Connecticut. As an aside, let me throw in a little tidbit here that I know you'll enjoy. There's an amazing foot race that takes place in July of each year called the Badwater Ultra Marathon. They're having it this year, July 13th to 15th, 2021. So it's not too late to get your tickets. This foot race follows the 135 miles of road and trail from the lowest place in the U.S., Badwater, on the floor of the lowest part of Death Valley, to the highest place in the continental United States, the 14,500-foot summit of Mount Whitney. Because of the mountain ranges you have to go up and down over in between the start and the finish, the race involves a cumulative climb or gain for the runners of over 19,000 feet. And since the runners, once they reach the finish line at the summit, must return to the trailhead where the road ends or where the cars are parked, that's an additional 11 miles from the summit. As a result, the race requires a total of 146 miles. The race was canceled in 2020 due to COVID, but in 2019, it was won by a Japanese man who ran the whole course in 21 hours and 33 minutes. That's an average of over 6.3 miles an hour. Imagine running 135 miles nonstop, starting in 120-plus degree temperatures, then up to freezing cold, uphill a cumulative 19,000 feet, and downhill the same amount, all in less than a day at that sizzling pace. It boggles the mind. Now back to more extremes of California. Let's talk about dryness. The dryness of a place can refer to either of two different things. First, the dryness of a place can refer to the amount of annual rainfall in inches. A rainfall of less than 4 inches a year means that a place is defined by climatologists as officially a desert. Dryness is also a term which refers to relative humidity, which is the proportional amount of water vapor in the air compared to what it could hold at a particular temperature. So there are two entirely different meanings to dryness: annual rainfall and relative humidity. Furnace Creek in California is the driest place in the United States in terms of rainfall, receiving an average of less than 2.2 inches a year. But that's an average over this large area. It's common for parts of Death Valley National Park to not receive a drop of rain for 5 years. Then there can be a deluge. That is exactly what happened during the night of October the 18th, 2015, when a huge thunderstorm parked itself over the Grapevine Mountains above a famous landmark in northern Death Valley called Scotty's Castle, which is a huge castle-like home built in the middle of nowhere by a Chicago railroad magnate back in the 1920s. The castle is now a museum and a Death Valley tourist attraction. The sudden rainfall in 2015 caused an immense flash flood, where the steep terrain concentrated the rain runoff into a relatively narrow canyon, damaging the castle and completely washing away outbuildings and completely destroying and washing away a large 2-lane paved road for miles in and out of the area. The repairs have taken many years and it's still not finished, although expected to be completed by November of this year. Now back to the other type of dryness, relative humidity. California is also the place which has many times recorded what was, at the time it was recorded, the lowest scientifically recorded humidity in the entire world. That place that experienced this world record dryness is the Barcroft Research Station, run by the University of California at Berkeley. That station, where high-altitude research is carried out, is located at 12,470 feet elevation in the high, remote, and waterless White Mountains of California, north of Death Valley. So why is it so dry there? The prevailing westerly winds bring moist air from the Pacific Ocean, which is first drained of some of its moisture as it flows over the coast mountain ranges near the ocean. These mountains are fairly small. They range from 4,000 to 8,000 feet. The air is further desiccated as it crosses the dry San Joaquin Valley, and then is wrung out a great deal more as the air is pushed up over the Sierra Nevada, the highest mountain range in the continental United States, whose crest, just west of the White Mountains, is over 12,000 feet above sea level, with a number of 14,000 plus peaks. The air is further dried as it flows across the near-desert Owens Valley to the White Mountains. It's desiccated a final time as the air ascends the very high White Mountains that parallel the Sierra Nevada. White Mountain Peak at 14,242 peak is the third highest peak in California, and it's right next to the Barcroft Research Station. By the time the air reaches the station, it is incredibly dry, and on more than one occasion scientifically measured to be drier than any relative humidity ever recorded in the entire world. Now, there have been some measurements in the desert since then, in the Middle East and Iran, which measured or purported to measure lower humidity, but they were all taken at midday during periods of extremely high temperature, all the temperatures above 115 degrees Fahrenheit. These high temperatures increase the amount of water vapor that the air can hold relative to what it is holding, thus lowering relative humidity. But these measurements taken at such extreme midday temperatures are considered a distorted measurement. The measurements taken at the Barcroft were taken at a wide range of times and temperatures and are considered more reflective of the true relative humidity. The evidence that the air high in the White Mountains of California is overall the driest air on Earth. Now back to rainfall. The deserts of southeastern California receive very little rain. In fact, there are vast swaths of this desert southeastern portion of California that's bigger than many states in the east that receives less than 4 inches of rain a year. Now remember, Death Valley gets about half that much. But continuing California's diversity theme, only 300 miles northwest from the White Mountains, all along the Pacific coast, north of San Francisco, all the way to Oregon, California has dense, lush redwood rainforests that receive over 100 inches of rain each year, in some places over 125 inches. This is where the towering coast redwoods grow, another California superlative, the tallest trees on Earth. There are a number of individual trees growing in the Redwood National Park along California's northwest coast that live in deep canyons alongside rivers that have been officially measured to stand over 400 feet tall. Imagine a tree 100 foot taller than a football field is long. They grow in California. California is superlative in terms of its size, too. It's a bit skinny west to east, but it's a whopping 1,040 miles from its northern border with Oregon to its southern border with Mexico, the biggest north-south difference of any of the lower 48 states. This is a link to many who live in the East and Midwest that's hard to grasp. California is so long, north to south, that if you metaphorically snipped it out with a pair of scissors and dragged it to the East Coast, California would stretch from Maine to Georgia. And if you walk south down California's zigzagging beaches, you would rack up 3,500 miles before you reach the Mexican border. California is only the third largest state in terms of square miles. It's behind Texas and Alaska. But many states in the East are quite small relative to California. This is very significant politically and culturally. To give you a graphic idea of how much bigger California is compared to many states in the East, if you create a new state by smushing together 12 existing states, that new state that you would create by smushing these other states together, these dozen states, would be 10,000 square miles smaller in physical size than California. Here are the 12 states whose combined area is less than California: Rhode Island, Delaware, Connecticut, Hawaii, New Jersey, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, Maryland, West Virginia, South Carolina, and Maine. You put all these 12 states together, and the area is still smaller than California. A further example to illustrate how big California is, it's over twice as big in terms of square miles as Great Britain. 2 Great Britons would fit inside California with room to spare. California is bigger than Italy, Belgium, and Switzerland combined. Now, in terms of population, California is also superlative. With 40 million residents, the most of any state by far, 12 million more than Texas, which is the second most populous state. California is the most populous subnational economy in the world. Only 36 nations have a greater population. California has 5 million more people than Canada. California's bigger population than the continental nation of Australia and the island nation of New Zealand combined, more than the combined population of 21 other U.S. states. Now think for a second about the politics of that last comparison. There are 21 other states, nearly half the states in the United States, which together have a veto-proof, filibuster-proof Senate majority and a combined population of less than California. But they get 42 senators in the United States Senate. California, with a bigger population, only gets 2. Another way of expressing this in political terms is that the vote of a resident of Wyoming, a state with a population of 587,000, counts over 68 times more in selecting members of the United States Senate in the same vote of a California resident. Given how out of whack this is, especially given the United States was supposedly based its governance on democratic principles, it might be worth stopping here for a moment to reflect on how the decision was made to give each state 2 senators, regardless of population. This decision, of course, was made and voted on at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787 when the Constitution was being approved. James Madison, a Virginian, in his original draft on this issue, which was referred to at the convention as the Virginia Plan, proposed that the number of senators for each state would be determined just like the number of representatives in the House, in proportion to the right of suffrage, meaning in proportion to each state's population. But Madison's draft, the Virginia Plan, included in each state's population both the free persons and the slaves in his definition of the right of suffrage. In other words, under Madison's proposal, if a particular state had, for example, a combined population of slaves and non-slaves of 100,000, and another state had a population of 50,000 with no slaves, the state with 100,000 would get to send twice as many representatives to the House and twice as many senators to the Senate as the state with a right of suffrage of 50,000. Not surprisingly, this Virginia plan was unacceptable to the small northern states like Delaware for several obvious reasons. First, these small states had no slaves and were already outnumbered by the white non-slave residents in the southern states. This proposal, by including slaves in the determination of representatives and senators, made that balance much worse. Those small states also argued, correctly and logically, that by law, slaves were considered legally property, not persons entitled to constitutional rights under law like voting. So it was unfair, these small states argued, to count them as persons for purposes of apportioning the number of senators or representatives a state should have. Worst of all, from the point of view of the small northern states, slaves were continuing to be imported in large numbers into the southern states, a process that was expected to go on indefinitely and probably accelerate. In light of that, the small northern states were convinced that as time went on and that disparity grew, their rights and voices in Congress would be drowned out by the huge and ever-growing number of slaves in the southern states. The delegates to the convention, sitting in the convention hall in powdered wigs, in sweltering summer heat, went round and round about this bitterly contentious issue and almost derailed the whole thing, the drafting of the new Constitution. But finally, a compromise plan was reached called the Connecticut Plan, or the Great Compromise of 1787. Under this plan, slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of apportioning seats in the House of Representatives. That was pretty close to the original Virginia plan that Madison had proposed. But the real change in the Great Compromise, the one that made all the difference, was that each state would receive only 2 senators, regardless of population. At that time, Virginia, the most populous state, had over 700,000 persons, of which almost 200,000 were slaves. This gave Virginia a total of about 8 times the population of the least populated state, Delaware, if slaves were not counted, and 12 times the population of Delaware if they were. By reason of this deal, Virginia still got a lion's share of the House seats, but little Delaware got to keep the same number of senators as Virginia. This was profoundly significant, since no legislation can pass Congress without the approval of the Senate. It certainly appears today to Californians that Delaware and the other small states got the far better end of that deal. And that deal is what our Constitution provides, and of course, it remains unchanged to this day. And this is how this whole now way out of whack system for picking senators came to be. It was a deal cut by men in powdered wigs in a steaming hot, unair-conditioned room in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 to address how slaves would be counted in the apportionment of senators and House representatives. And this is yet another of the many long shadows cast by slavery that are still with us and still shading us to this very day. While this deal is still with us, unchanged, look how much the United States has changed. In 1787, Philadelphia was a city with a population of a mere 25,000. California was a new Spanish colony called the Viceroy of New Spain, and for practical purposes, the other side of the world. California was just then being colonized, with a non-native population of only a few thousand people scattered among a handful of tiny missions along the central and southern coast. The very idea, the notion that the United States would grow and grow and grow to someday, 234 years into the future, stretch across the entire North American continent and include California as a state, and that California itself would have a population in 2021 of over 15 times the combined total of all of the 13 original states in 1787. Understandably, this outcome was simply beyond anything that the Founding Fathers could have ever imagined. So let's leave this fascinating discussion of how we got into this fine mess, at least from the point of view of California, of distorted Senate representation, and go back to California's superlatives. Now, let's talk about money. As you would expect, California's economy is gigantic. A lot of people can't even imagine just how huge it really is. With a GDP of over $3.2 trillion, excepting the United States itself, California's economy is bigger than the entire national economies of all but 3 other nations on Earth. The global ranking of economies in terms of size, or GDP, is U.S., China, Japan, Germany, and California. Outside the U.S., California is the 4th largest economy in the world. California is bigger than the economies of France or England or Brazil with 213 million people, or Indonesia with 270 million, or even India with 1.3 billion. Their economies are each smaller. California's economy is more than twice the size of the entire Russian Federation. If California were a nation, it would be twice as economically powerful as Russia. Now here's where it gets more interesting. The median family income in California is $78,000, but the median of the entire U.S. is only $68,000. California's is more, but not as much more as one might expect, certainly in view of the great wealth in California. So what is going on here? Why is the median family income for California so low, especially since the average family income in California is $114,000 a year? The fact is that the difference between the statistical median family and the average shows you an ugly fact. California has far more poor people than any other state, and the rich people make a lot more money. The spread between these two things shows that California has the highest proportional rate of poverty of any state, higher than the District of Columbia. Per capita, even with its huge population, California has 3 times as many people living in poverty as Iowa, which is the lowest rate of poverty of any state. Over 15% of all Californians, that's 6 million people, currently live below the federal poverty line. And many experts think that's a significant undercount. They think the truth is it's closer to 1 in 5, or about 8 million. That's 8 million people in California living in poverty. And now let's stop and talk for a second about what the federal poverty level means. We hear this term a lot. It's a U.S. government definition of what it means to be, in quote, poverty. What it means is that a person has to live below a certain minimum income threshold to be considered to be in poverty, in quotes, by the federal government. Folks, that threshold is low, really, really low. It's starvation low. Currently, the federal poverty threshold means that if you're single, to be considered in poverty means you have an annual income of less than $12,880 a year. For a family of 4 persons, imagine a single mom and 3 kids. To live below the poverty line means that you have to earn less than $26,500 a year. Imagine a family of 4 trying to live on that much anywhere in the U.S., especially in California. So by now you're probably asking yourself, hey, aren't there a lot of rich people in California? What gives with all this poverty? To answer this, we have to go back to the theme of how disparate California is compared to its various parts, how different each part is from the other. More so, remember, than any place on Earth. And we're not just talking about economic differences, but demographics, climate, education, and more. This is something that very few people in the rest of the world or in the U.S. understand about California. So let's talk about these vast disparities, which will help you understand California. Let's start with a quick romp around the very diverse regions of California, which most Americans have no idea even exist. Let's start with the northwest corner of California. This is a vast redwood forested region north of San Francisco, stretching for hundreds of miles along the rugged Pacific coast, all the way to the Oregon border. This region has very high rainfall, about 100 inches in most areas a year, and a fishing and lumber-based economy with some mining. All those industries are in the tank now. Some counties tried growing marijuana for a while, but now most growers are facing fierce legal competition. This area's regional economy is struggling and has been for decades. Moving now over to the northeast corner of California, here is a huge New England-sized region that, when you see it, looks just like Wyoming. It's high, sagebrush-covered desert surrounded by gorgeous forested mountains. You would never think you were in California, at least not the typical depiction of California. This northeast corner has the same sort of ranching and mining economy as much of the interior West. Neither are doing well. According to the Casper, Wyoming Star-Tribune, reporting in January of this year, quote, Wyoming lost 14,000 jobs in 2020, a decline of 5%, and since November 2020 alone, 6,000 mining jobs have vanished from Wyoming, a 29% decline from only a year ago, unquote. Large portions of this region in the northeast corner of California have a similar economy to Wyoming, and they have experienced similar economic problems and decline. Moving now to the southeast corner of California, this region is an immense. Let's turn now to the next region of California, the so-called Central Valley. This is the area between the coastal mountain ranges on the western side of California and the Cascades and the Sierra Nevada on the eastern side. The dominant feature of this entire region is its enormous, extremely fertile valley, 40 to 60 miles wide and 460 miles long. It is called the Central Valley. It's subdivided into the Sacramento Valley to the north and the San Joaquin Valley to the south. This region is the United States farming powerhouse. It is by far the largest and most productive agricultural region in the whole United States. Most Americans have never heard of the Central Valley, and they don't know that it produces nearly 40% of all the crops in the entire United States. 5,000 wineries there grow 81% of the U.S. wine, exporting $1.5 billion of wine, 3/4 of all the fruits and nuts in the U.S., and over 35% of the vegetables of the nation, of the United States, come from this valley. This area was taken over by large agribusiness corporations well over a generation ago, and it continues to shed jobs as small family farms give way to vast agribusiness enterprises. So while the Central Valley's economy is booming in terms of productivity and crop volumes and the bottom lines of its agribusiness companies, the fortunes of most of those who live there are stagnant or in decline. The next region includes the western foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. This area has long been called the Gold Country because that's where the Placer gold mining took place during the gold rush. The gold is long gone. This area used to have lumber and tourism and mining, but all three of them are in great decline, as is the whole area. The remaining regions of California are its success stories. There's a wealthy strip down the Central Coast with thriving wineries. There's LA and its giant basin, a vast population center of over 10 million people, with a booming, highly diversified, and successful import-export economy, including most of the U.S. entertainment industry. As we go down the coast from Los Angeles to Orange County, we find many affluent and booming towns engaged in the Asia trade, tech, import-export. And then there's the highly successful city of San Diego and its booming, wealthy suburbs. And finally, there is the highly influential, vastly affluent Texark region around the San Francisco Bay that Californians call the Bay Area. The term Bay Area refers to the 9 small counties that touch the San Francisco Bay and its sister estuary, the San Pablo Bay. The Bay Area is located about a third of the way down the coast from Oregon. 7.8 million Californians live in these 9 counties called the Bay Area. It's a fairly small area. It's about 80 miles long and 45 miles wide, and you can see across it from one end to the other. From my house on the north shore of San Francisco Bay, I can look south and see the Santa Cruz Mountains. They're only 3,000 to 4,000 feet high, about 65 miles south of me, and they're south of and beyond Silicon Valley, and thus beyond the Bay Area. And if you look northeast from my house, you can see the small mountain range on the east side of Napa County to the north, which is also beyond the Bay Area. That's how small it is. And despite its urbanness, the Bay Area is full of preserved wild spaces, parks, forests, waterfalls, wild lakes, gorgeous beaches, and open spaces. I can ride my mountain bike for 30 miles from my office, which was near the bay in Larkspur, in the eastern side of Marin County, all the way to Point Reyes National Seashore and the Pacific Oceans, through deep forests, past streams, lakes, waterfalls, and crossing only one small 2-lane road and staying in the wilderness the whole way. This little region, the Bay Area, is far and away the richest place on earth, with the highest average family incomes in the United States or any place in the world. Despite its tiny size, the Bay Area is the overwhelmingly dominant power in high-tech industry worldwide. The Bay Area is also the most educated place in the United States. In large portions of this region, over a third of those over 30 have a master's degree or higher. And it's brimming with over 60 major universities and colleges, including Stanford and the University of California at Berkeley and San Francisco. You see, Berkeley alone is the #1 ranked public university in the United States. It's produced 110 Nobel laureates. Stanford produced 32, 17 are teaching there. 61 laureates live in California. More than 10% of all the Nobel laureates in the world between 1900 and 2012 were Californians. And the majority of them were in the Bay Area. The little Bay Area is so wealthy that if this little tiny region were a country, it would be the 18th largest economy in the world, bigger than Sweden, Saudi Arabia, Poland, and nearly 3 times the size of Indonesia, with a population of 270 million. The Bay Area includes the fascinating city of San Francisco, which for 2 generations after the Gold Rush was the largest and indeed the only city west of Chicago. So let's talk a bit about this fascinating city of San Francisco. If you're coming from afar to visit it, the first thing you'll be surprised about is how tiny it is. It's shaped like an upside-down Florida, jutting off a narrow peninsula surrounded by water on 3 sides. The San Francisco Bay on the right, Pacific Ocean on the left, and a narrow channel with the Golden Gate Bridge over it to the north. It's only 46 square miles, 6 by 8 miles. You can stroll across it in a couple of hours. There's a foot race every year called the Bay to Breakers, and it goes from downtown by the bay all the way out to the Pacific Ocean, zigging and zagging, so it's a bit over 7 miles. And the runners run this in less than 33 minutes. Because of its tiny geographic area, San Francisco has a relatively small population, 880,000, compared to the other big cities in the United States. To get perspective here, there's only 10 million people in Los Angeles County and 8.3 million in New York City. Still, San Francisco economy is so powerful that if teeny tiny San Francisco were a country, it would be the 28th largest economy in the world. It's the home of 42 billionaires, the highest per capita in the world. In San Francisco in 2019 had the highest salaries of any city in the world and the second highest income and per capita GDP, edged out by San Jose, its sister city to the north, which is the most educated city in North America, with 40% of those over 25 having a master's degree or higher, and over almost 2/3 with a BA. San Francisco is no stranger to tech innovation. Most people don't know that television was invented in San Francisco in 1927. This year, San Francisco is the recipient of a staggering 1/3 of the entire investment of venture capital in the entire United States. The Bay Area received 45%. The amount committed to San Francisco amounts to a fifth of all the venture capital raised worldwide. And almost all of this is being invested or committed into a tiny area in San Francisco that you could walk across in less than 30 minutes. There, the future is being invented today. Things people can't imagine today, but will take for granted 10 years from now, are being invented in San Francisco as we speak. People in the year 2031 AD will ask, as they do today, about Google, GPS, smartphones, desktop computers, Twitter, Facebook, and apps, all of which, except for GPS, were invented in San Francisco or next door in Silicon Valley. How did people, way back in 2021, ever get by without X or Y, meaning devices and inventions that are being developed as we speak right now in San Francisco? It's widely accepted that San Francisco, with just over 2% of the population of California, is far and away the most influential city in California. Indeed, many believe it's the most influential city in all of the United States. To see one reason why it's so influential, look at the current number of San Franciscans who hold high public office in Sacramento and Washington. The current Vice President of the United States is Kamala Harris, a San Franciscan. She was the DA in San Francisco before she became the United States Senator for California. In 1991, Dianne Feinstein became a Senator of California, and she has deep roots in San Francisco. She was the mayor for 10 years and the president of Board of Supervisors before that. I used to work with her on real estate projects. Former San Francisco Mayor Gavin Newsom is the current governor of California. And Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House in Washington, third in line of succession to be president, is a longtime resident and representative of the 12th Congressional District, which is entirely in the city and county of San Francisco. The Secretary of State, Treasurer, and many other key senators and representatives in Sacramento are also San Franciscans. The sheer footprint, weight, and influence of current and former San Franciscans in Washington and Sacramento gives the geographically tiny city of San Francisco, with only 2% of Californians within its border, a hugely disproportionate influence. For several decades after the gold rush in the 1850s, San Francisco was the richest city in the world, a title that it is currently on track to reclaim before the end of this decade. And during the gold rush and for a generation afterward, San Francisco was the only real American city west of Chicago. And because the gold concentrated everyone in San Francisco dominated the entire West Coast, and it had more registered voters within its tiny borders than the rest of the state of California combined. It took several generations, almost at the beginning of the 20th century, when Los Angeles began to be populated by the Southern Pacific Railway. Congress subsidized the Southern Pacific to take people from the east to LA for $1 apiece. And after a few years of that, and it took a few years of that, for the rest of California residents to outnumber and outvote the voters within the city limits of tiny San Francisco. And actually, it took until then before the number of women in California came to equal the number of men, because the gold rush brought hordes of just men and almost no women. Let's talk about San Francisco's problems. Remember, it happens first in California, than it happens in the rest of the U.S. San Francisco had the highest income equality in 1950 in the entire U.S. It was the most egalitarian city. The top 20% in San Francisco in 1950 earned less than 4 times the earnings of the bottom 20%. That was a Scandinavian level of equality. But by 2012, San Francisco had switched all the way around from being the best to being the worst. It became the most unequal city in terms of income, the worst in the whole U.S. And a few years before 2012, tech workers began to come on the scene and begin to rocketing ahead in terms of their income, while the bottom tier fell further and further. Then Mark Zuckerberg came to town with Facebook, and he gave his secretaries and ordinary office workers a pretty significant amount of stock in Facebook. And when they went public with Facebook, the stock had gone up hundreds of times in values. So this meant that they were made millionaires out of thousands and thousands of secretaries and ordinary office workers. And that puts San Francisco at the top of the cities in the U.S. with the biggest have versus have-not gap. In fact, if you're not in tech, or we're not in tech, and even now are profiting off of it, like being a consultant, a banker, a lawyer, CPA for tech, if you're just a regular person, like a cop, a teacher, a retail clerk, you're not getting a penny of that tech money. Ever since 2012 and the big Facebook payday, San Francisco's gone back and forth between being the first and fourth place in terms of being the worst in terms of the most unequal treatment of diversion of income in the U.S. And it's now joined in that shameful distinction by the entire Bay Area, which in 2019, workers in the 90th percentile in the Bay Area earned $384,000 a year, while those at the 10% level earned a meager $32,000, a vast income gulf of 12.2 times, unequaled in any state or region in the United States or even in the entire world. In 2005, the mayor of San Francisco, Ed Lee, said, as all mayors and governors want to do the world over, if elected, I'll bring jobs to San Francisco. Well, did he ever? Well, whether he or his policies actually created these jobs and brought them is a matter of some controversy, and whether he had nothing to do with it. Politicians claiming credit for things that they had nothing to do with has been the subject of jokes about politicians for generations. For example, Lyndon Johnson is reputed to have tried to claim credit for a drought stopping in the Midwest during his administration. You're not going to try to claim credit for that, are you? Thundered the Senate Republican Majority Leader Everett Dirksen incredulously. Why not? Shrugged Lyndon with a smile. It happened during my administration. During San Francisco Mayor Ed Lee's administration from 2005 to 2011, an almost unimaginable 140,000 new, extremely high-paying jobs came to tiny San Francisco, a city then with a mere 805,000 residents. That was a record, whopping number, a world record. So be careful what you wish for. The number of high-paying jobs that suddenly came to town was so huge that it created an array of horrendous problems in housing and elsewhere that remain to this day and are unsolved, some of them. First, nearly all these jobs were astronomically high-paying tech jobs or feasting off that tech sector. And that compounded the misery for the non-tech workers and the others already struggling to get by in a city flooded with rich newcomers, many so young it looked like kids, and they quickly drove up the cost of everything. The problem was vastly and synergetically compounded that already existing and seemingly intractable problem of housing. Housing has always been San Francisco's Achilles heel. Housing in a waterlogged, high-density, long ago built-out city is always a huge problem and exacerbates its other problems. Unlike cities like Sacramento, Dallas, or Oklahoma City, cities where you just go to the city limits where there's open cornfields and build stuff there. or in sparsely developed cities like Oklahoma City, which is the least densely populated city in the United States, with only 1,000 people per square mile. San Francisco is 19 times denser in Oklahoma City. In Oklahoma City, you don't have to go outside the city limits to find vacant lots or open spaces. They're inside the city. And if you want to build, you just go to these vacant lots or open spaces and build things. But San Francisco, long ago, was built out to the brim, to the water's edge. It is now the second densest city in the United States. 19,000 people per square mile. New York is more at 27. And San Francisco is bounded by water on 3 sides. It's got nowhere to go for space. The housing problem in San Francisco has been made exponentially worse by boneheaded planning policies. For decades, especially during Ed Lee's tenure, San Francisco city planners and their counterparts in many other cities in the Bay Area and elsewhere eagerly approved all of the flood of applications of developers in the downtown office area to build these tall, gleaming skyscrapers. They needed office space for all those jobs, right? Tens of millions of office space, deluxe offices were built in San Francisco. At the same time, there were a lot less places to live that were being approved. Over 20 years, San Francisco approved 3 office spaces for people to work for every, on average, residential dwelling unit for people to live. That's a 3-to-1 ratio. 3 places to work for 1 place to live. You don't need a PhD in city planning to forecast the result. It's simply a matter of supply and demand. Housing, both homes and rental units, were quickly bid up to the moon and the stars, quickly making San Francisco the most expensive apartment rental and home price market in North America. This created misery for everyone not in on the tech boom. Now, 2 things should be noted about this housing shortage. First, once a city, any city, gets built out, as San Francisco is, without any remaining unused space, especially a super dense, waterlogged city like San Francisco, it's near impossible to go back and redo it and make room for a big influx of new people. Think about it. To redo the city to accommodate a large number of additional residents would require literally tearing it apart. You'd have to add wider roads, more electricity, water, sewers, transportation. You'd have to tear down existing single-family housing and build in its place high-density, high-rise apartment housing or condos, all of which damages and lowers the value of the single-family homes in those existing neighborhoods. Such construction is universally unpopular all over the United States among the people who live in those neighborhoods, whether they're rich or poor, liberals or conservatives. The slogan NIMBY, N-I-M-B-Y, which stands for Not in My Backyard, is something that everybody, even Democrats and Republicans, can agree on. And this is one of the contributing factors of how we got into this fine mess of housing shortages. But fortunately, currently in San Francisco, there's a broad and earnest recognition of this problem by the mayor and the board of supervisors, and there's before them a host of new programs and possible solutions that are being given serious consideration. They have already approved a number of very large housing projects involving tens of thousands of new units on Navy port land and other areas that were previously considered too slummy or too toxic. And they're spending the money to clean them up and creating whole new neighborhoods that will make these neighborhoods look unrecognizable given the scale of the construction when they're done. And since we're not building any offices right now, and entire new neighborhoods of housing are being created, this experiment may well meaningfully ease the problem of affordable housing. Housing prices are extremely sensitive to supply and demand. And with these large new developments in the pipeline to be built in San Francisco, that will put large numbers of homes on the market, and that may well cause the prices for single-family homes to decline until they become affordable. We shall see. Now let's go back to California as a whole. Given its prominence and leadership role, it was inevitable, of course, that developments in California and its policies would become entangled in the whole national conservative liberal debate. California's become an unwitting proxy to a wide range of government policies and business models, with both sides pointing to California and arguing that what is happening in California proves the truth of their respective narrative or business model. Against this backdrop, the trends in California are analyzed and then explained and weaponized for how they fit into the various partisan narratives. The objective of this podcast is not to take sides in this. Instead, this podcast aspires to give you, the listener, a briefing on and insight into the actual facts, with the view that those facts will help you to understand what is really going on. There is a popular parlor game that has been played from time to time for several generations in outlets in the U.S. media. And this game is a periodic replay of some version of the San Francisco is over or California is over theme. This line has always been wrong, and it's wrong now. But this shtick got a huge boost recently when, for the first time in over 170 years as a state, the population of California in 2020 actually went down year over year, with a total decline of about 180,000 during the pandemic, which is less than 0.5% of California's population. But it wasn't just Fox News and the right-wing media that led the chorus of schadenfreude giddy pundits, using the quote, "people are leaving California in droves." I saw a number of articles illustrated by drawings, not pictures, of lines of cars pulling identical U-Hauls driving down the Coast Highway, which incidentally goes north and south, not out of California. Here, said some of these pundits, gleefully pointing to this tiny pandemic downtick, is proof at last that California is declining, that the quality of life in California is terrible, and all of this is caused by and the result of California's policies, or its, as the Republicans say, their radical socialist agenda. Let's unpack this claim by first noting that West Virginia, a state that Trump won by a whopping 39% in 2020, the second highest total, lost 59,000 residents in the last census, the largest proportional decline of any state, a total of 3.2% of its entire population. In California, gained 6.5% or 2.4 million in the same period. West Virginia's loss caused it to lose one of its 3 congressional seats in Congress, or a third of its political voting power in the House. That is 18 times the proportion that California lost by losing one of its 53 seats in the House. Likewise, Mississippi and Illinois also lost population, again, while California grew in the same period by 2.4 million. You will hear no one saying that the reason that Mississippi and West Virginia lost population was because of their hard-right politics. But the internet is awash with those claiming that the socialist, radical leftist politics are what is behind California's tiny dip in population. These kind of stories have long been a staple of certain parts in the media and are a source of amusement here in California. A few years ago, Governor Rick Perry made periodic high-profile trips to California. He called them raids, to take jobs away from California and take them back to Texas. California's Governor Jerry Brown likewise joined this game and did the same in Texas. They both got a lot of press. Terry got more jobs than Brown. But what was not covered very well or adequately is that the jobs that went from California to Texas were overwhelmingly minimum wage jobs, while the jobs that went from Texas to California were almost all high-tech and paid well into 6 figures. There's another critical bellwether movement that was not discussed in these stories about people leaving California, quote, in droves, and about Rick Perry's poaching minimum wage jobs. That is the fact in the past 5 years, California has vacuumed up 150,000 plus of the coveted top graduates of the most elite and expensive universities and colleges in the United States outside California, including the University of Texas at Austin. Those states, including Texas, spend a lot of money at those schools, educating those graduates, only to see them pick up and move to California and take their expensive taxpayer-funded education and training with them. They were the best of the best, and they were voting with their feet as to where they think the best opportunities and the quality of life in the future is going to be. Also not mentioned in those stories, and another key element in this story that dovetails with the top graduates coming to California and the venture capital being invested here. Despite California's losing a tiny bit of population in 2020, that same year, and this gives us critical insight again into who is coming and who is leaving California. In San Francisco and the Bay Area, there was the greatest influx of jobs and the biggest increase in prices for homes ever in history. Prices in the Bay Area, especially in some San Francisco neighborhoods, zoomed up over 35% in 2021 over 2020. That was the biggest year-over-year increase in history. The median price of all single-family homes in San Francisco is now over $1.8 million. That's 5.5 times the median price of a home in the United States. These facts clearly evidence that the wealthy and successful are continuing to come to San Francisco and the Bay Area. The United States Supreme Court Justice Cardoso once famously said that states are the laboratories of democracy, meaning that different government policies could be tried in various states. The other states could watch and compare the results, like a scientific experiment to empirically test a hypothesis. This is one reason why what is happening in California is of such acute interest in so many political quarters, and especially so in Republicans and conservative circles, because they've long believed and argued that for growth and prosperity, we as a society need to use a business model that features low taxes, low wages, and low regulations. Democrats prefer to refer to regulations as protections of the environment, workers, and citizens. The low taxes, low wages, low regulations is the fundamental bedrock policy of Republican governance. California's, and especially the Bay Area's business model, is just the exact opposite. High taxes, high wages, the highest in the world, and high levels of government protections, in other words, regulations. There's a lot at stake in this wordplay. California is an obvious proxy for one of the two sides' fundamental economic and political agenda. So which business model is winning? The median household income in the Bay Area, in Los Angeles, and much of San Diego is roughly twice as high as the United States as a whole. Even if you take out the cost of living, the high taxes, the high cost of housing, food, transportation, the areas throughout the United States with the highest taxes, regulation, and wages are precisely those areas with the strongest economies, the highest rates of growth, and the highest net earnings in the pockets of its citizens. These results are not limited to the Bay Area or even to California. For decades, the minimum household income all over the Bay Area and in California as a whole has been growing much faster than it has been for the United States as a whole. Indeed, this is where it gets really interesting. The income and economics of the red states that have voted for Republican state governments are in many cases going backwards economically. And if they're growing at all, they're growing at only a fraction of the rate that the blue states with Democratic majorities are growing. So dramatic is this shift that the United States has already split into two different economies. Between 2008 and 2018, the gross domestic product of all House congressional districts controlled by Republicans declined from $33.2 billion to $32.6 billion, while the districts controlled by Democrats have enjoyed an eye-popping increase of over 1/3 in their economic output. This productivity per worker in those red districts have been stuck at $110,000 for that same decade, while productivity of workers in blue Democratic districts have surged from $118,000 to $139,000 per worker. Democratic districts have seen their minimum household increase from $54,000 to $61,000, while the minimum household income in Republican districts has declined from $55,000 to $53,000. There are profound implications in these statistics. The differences are so dramatic and so precisely, indisputably linked to districts, states, policies, and parties that the broad factual outcomes of this experiment are very hard to deny. Because there's so much at stake between these dueling business models, that explains why so much is made of California's small dip in population, and also why so much is made of homelessness in wealthy cities like Seattle and San Francisco. I have some personal knowledge about this issue because I lead 4 different history tours in San Francisco for the city of San Francisco. And from time to time, I have personally encountered homeless people in the downtown area when I lead my Gold Rush tour. I've been speaking to them for years, and even before that, when I went to law school there many, many years ago. I ask the homeless when I encounter them, where are you from? Why are you here in San Francisco, as opposed to, say, Reno or Denver or New Orleans? The answers given to me comport precisely with what numerous organizations and pollsters have found, and that is that the great majority of the homeless are not San Franciscans and are not from San Francisco. They were not made homeless because of any government policy in San Francisco or in California. They came to San Francisco, many from the rest of the U.S. They were attracted to San Francisco because it's a warm climate. It never gets below freezing. They also came to San Francisco because the people are friendly. They get generous handouts when they beg, and the city of San Francisco spends nearly $500 million on benefits and outreach to the homeless through their navigation centers, which dispense food, housing, vouchers, medical, and social and mental health care and other needs. Unfortunately, the more that San Francisco spends on the homeless, the more the homeless will come to San Francisco, and the more that some people will blame San Francisco for the homeless that are present there. The reason that we are mentioning the existence and presence of homelessness people in a few California cities here is that they are used as evidence that California is a failed state and its progressive and liberal politics are somehow behind this and creating homeless. This despite the help wanted signs that cover San Francisco and the Bay Area, with jobs going begging for applicants. The problem of homelessness is not caused by California policies, with perhaps the exception to a minor degree of the policies regarding housing in its dense cities, which are indeed making things worse. Instead, California's wealthy regions are the victims of their own successes. When they created huge numbers of extremely high-paying jobs suddenly, that caused dislocations, especially in long built-out cities like San Francisco. But San Francisco is trying very hard to address this problem by devoting enormous resources to solving it. And San Francisco and the other wealthy California cities may well be able to mitigate or solve these problems in the next few years. So these and many other good and bad things are happening now in California first, because California is a trendsetter and things happen first here. But remember, what happens here will eventually happen to the rest of the United States. So where is California taking us now? What is happening here first that's going to happen later in the rest of the United States? In other words, what is in store for us as California takes us into the future? California has long been, and is today, about 15 years ahead of the rest of the United States, in many ways, especially confronting the new realities of the 21st century. But before I get into the future, I think it adds credibility to the notion of California's leadership, and it further proves the point about California's being 15 years ahead of the country, to look back now at how California has led the United States for decades, and not always to the left. Starting in the mid-1960s, California led the United States politically. California led the emergence of a new form of conservatism, championing small government, rolling back taxes, attacking welfare and public health care. Reagan gutted the local mental institutions in California. Many critics say that contributed to homelessness to this day. And California politicians led the United States in a host of hot-button culture issues, including being against gay marriage. California led the anti-tax movement with Prop 13, a ballot measure that capped property taxes. California led the way with anti-immigrant laws. And Ronald Reagan ran for governor of California on a right-wing platform. All this occurred when the rest of the U.S. as a whole was relatively much more liberal. California turned right, and conservative California elected Ronald Reagan as governor 14 years before the United States followed California's lead and elected Ronald Reagan president. America then followed California's lead in trending conservative and Republican. Those conservative ideas that began in California about small government, low taxes, slowly became mainstream ideas all over America. Then starting about 20 years ago in California, these political leanings and trends slowly began reversing themselves, so that now California is deeply liberal. And the United States is continuing to follow right in California's footsteps toward a much more liberal leftward tilt, even if it's 15 years behind. If you look at the demographic trends nationwide by age, race, sex, education, you can see how the United States is exactly following California's lead toward a more liberal trend. People rarely change their political orientation as they age, and the younger people are in the United States, the more liberal they tend to be, a fact with powerful implications for the future. Minorities are set to become a majority in the near future, and they tend to vote majority Democratic. Democrats won the popular vote in the last 4 elections. Hillary won the popular vote in 2016 by 3 million. Biden won it in 2020 by about 8 million. And there's no reason to think that these simple trends will not continue. So what is the path that California is following now into the future that the rest of the U.S. is likely to follow? The University of Iowa recently conducted a study that tracked 700 policies adopted by the United States since 2000 and found that the overwhelming majority originated in California. Overwhelmingly, quote, the study found, California is the overall leader in setting the national agenda, unquote. Let's quickly review some of these policies adopted by the U.S. that first began in California. Car emissions and gas standards began in California because that market was so huge and California was so influential that manufacturers abided by their requirements, and they allowed them to set the standards. The Trump administration overrode California's tougher emission standards. And then, in a stunning measure of California's power and influence, California openly and successfully defied the White House and the federal government's effort to weaken those standards. So powerful was California that in 2019, 4 automakers from 3 continents struck a deal with California, not the Trump administration or the federal government, undercutting the Trump administration's more aggressive climate policy rollbacks. After weeks of secret negotiations, Ford, Honda, Volkswagen, and BMW of North America reached an agreement with California, not the U.S., that will shape the future of U.S. vehicle production. When President Trump pulled the United States out of the Paris Climate Accord, California negotiated the same transaction with the province of Quebec, and the courts upheld it. California has been a leader in internet privacy laws, giving consumers the right to sue over breaches regarding their data. California is leading the way in the protection of employees, with a strong labor commission and state laws mandating sick leave, paid maternity and paternity care, equal pay laws, refusing to allow Lyft and Uber to treat drivers as independent contractors instead of employees, requiring them to be entitled to the protections of employees, such as minimum wage and a host of other protection. California has required women on boards, has been a leader in gay rights. The San Francisco mayor, now Governor Newsom, legalized gay marriage in San Francisco in 2008, and by 2015, the United States Supreme Court followed suit and legalized it nationwide. California required net neutrality, and Congress overrode it. California was the first to end cash bail, a system whose practical effect added no safety, but forced many poor into financial ruin, jailing them pending trial. California has long led on renewable energy. It introduced incentives through net metering by utilities, requiring those utilities to pay the owners of solar panels for the electricity that they generate and return to the grid. There are now 1 million homes in California with rooftop solar panels, 50% of all the solar panels in the whole United States. And we now have windmills in California providing the power sufficient for 2 million homes. California subsidizes the purchase of electric cars. My wife and I have not bought a drop of electricity in 5 years. California has mandated all electricity generated by utilities in California be from renewables by 2045. No more fossil fuels for that purpose. In an effort to reduce plastics ending up in rivers, lakes, and the ocean, California has banned hotels and motels from giving guests tiny plastic throwaway containers for shampoo and lotion, authorized cities and local governments to ban plastic bags in grocery stores, and is encouraging customers to use reusable bags. California has adopted the most ambitious clean energy recycling and sustainability measures in the world. California funded $3 billion for stem cell research. And the governor recently announced that California would begin to manufacture its own generic drugs. California is one of the leaders in marijuana reform and legalization, high minimum wages. San Francisco has the highest minimum wage in the United States, now at $16 an hour. There's $14 statewide. California has embraced science and has long been a leading voice for gay rights. California is led by integrating and embracing the Latino and Asian immigrants, and over 40% of Californians speak foreign language. And here are some things that almost no one outside of California is aware of. But on the political front, California was a once deeply red state, the home of Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon, the birthplace of the John Birch Society. But now, California is one of the most politically harmonious states as far as the Democrats and the Republicans are concerned. How did that happen? There are three trend-setting and profoundly important reforms that California took on this front that helped make this happen, along with a fourth, which was the election of a Democratic governor and a veto-proof Democratic supermajority in the California legislature. But the first major reform instituted in California was the abolishment of primaries. Party-run primaries are very popular in many states, but they fan the flames of division. They intimidate lawmakers who fear being primaried if they try to be bipartisan or moderate. Primaries ensure that the most extreme candidate from either side wins. In red districts, that means the most conservative person wins state office. And in blue district, it means the most liberal person wins. This is not a good omen for those politicians from the extreme wings of the respective parties who have to be able to sit down and work together once they reach the Capitol. What California did to resolve this was to embrace an innovative and imaginative reform and force all of the candidates of all the parties to run in one single primary against each other. Then the top two vote getters in that so-called jungle primary, whatever their party, and only those two, run against each other in the general election. This simple mechanism powerfully favors, indeed it almost guarantees, that the most moderate two persons will win the primary, and that ensures that the most moderate person will likely win in the general election when the two candidates run against each other. The second reform instituted by California took redistricting away from the politicians and put it in the hands of a neutral body. That neutral body draws the political districts. Thus, the lawmakers in Sacramento are now far more aligned with how the voters actually voted and thus more responsive to the majority and its will, which is how a democracy is supposed to work. In the old system, the party in power gerrymandered the districts to give their own party safe seats where they could afford to be extreme and concentrate their opposition party in dense clusters, giving themselves a slight majority in the rest of the seats. This always gives the party in power the majority of seats in the legislature, even when they represent a significant minority of the actual votes cast. We see this kind of gerrymander today in North Carolina and several Midwestern states, like Wisconsin, where Republicans constitute a minority of the voters, in some cases as low as 40%. But through this rigged gerrymandering, the minority controls 60% or so, in some cases more, of the state's legislative seats. This is not democracy. The third reform instituted in California involved repealing the two-thirds supermajority required to pass a budget in California, a provision that's analogous to the filibuster in the United States Senate. This made it much easier to pass timely budgets and stop the extortion and strangling of needed state spending on programs which the supermajority requirement encouraged. This is the role of the filibuster in the United States Senate today. It creates gridlock, it blocks the people's will, and it makes government dysfunctional. These three reforms in California, open primaries, neutral redistricting, and no supermajorities on budgets, have had a profound, gigantic impact. They made California much more governable and centrist, and that in turn has enabled lawmakers in Sacramento to concentrate on solving problems and engaging in good governance rather than attacking each other with political posturing, culture wars, bitter campaigns, and endless political fundraising. Culture wars, like the bitter contest over who gets to use a bathroom, have been very debilitating to the United States. These wars drain attention, money, and energy away from the huge challenges we face as a nation in climate change and distracting us from confronting China, which is preparing to challenge us across the board, militarily, in artificial intelligence, and a host of high-tech arenas and geopolitics, just to name a few problems. And California's 3 electoral reforms we've just discussed help end these wars in California politics. California, unlike what the far-right zealots would like to have you believe, is far from being a woke far-left place. California does not favor. Californians are not socialists or radicals. They have a healthy respect for the role of markets. Indeed, California is the home, the birthplace of the startup company, the ultimate manifestation of market capitalism. Also, Californians just don't buy the harsh right-wing orthodoxy about markets always being superior to government. Californians believe in trying to use government to help people and solve problems. There will always be discordant voices, and they're amplified by the far-right press. But if you look at the recent history of legislation in California that was actually enacted, what you see is not woke socialism, but instead legislation that clearly represents mainstream values and solutions. There are huge problems and challenges galore facing the Golden State, of which the biggest of all is climate change. But that is a problem that is largely out of California's control. And while it is far from perfect, California has succeeded in solving or mitigating most of its earlier problems, and it is eagerly embracing the challenges of the 21st century. Its economy is booming, and despite COVID, California is enjoying a blockbuster $76 billion budget surplus. California has never been richer, stronger, more successful, or more united than it is today. As we go forward, let's remember John F. Kennedy's observation that the future happens first in California. If you're listening to this podcast and you're not living in California, keep in mind that whatever happens here in California will likely someday soon come to a neighborhood near you.
This has been Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany, exploring deep stories from real-life guests with real-life experiences, providing insight to our listeners with every story. Stay up to date on future podcasts by bookmarking Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany.podbean.com and follow Bo on social media by searching Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany. Have an idea for a future story? Send your idea to acrmadison@gmail.com. Until next time, grab life by the horns and keep inspiring others.